Hi, everybody. My name is Claire Suckman. I'm the principal of Virtual Team Builders, and our company helps leaders build high-performance teams in this new environment. We've worked with corporate, we've worked with government agencies for the last 30 years, including Ernst & Young, RBC, GlaxoSmithKline, Canada Revenue Agency, Fisheries and Oceans, Climate Change, and Environment and Climate Change. And it's a pleasure to be here. And Lee, could you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. My name is Lee Abbott, and I'm one of the developers and facilitators with Virtual Team Builders. And I work also with, we call it teams with this new environment. It's really the latest iteration of the work environment, whether they're remote, on-site, or hybrid. And I specialize in change management as well for teams working in these different contexts. So looking forward to discussing some of the leadership strategies that are really relevant for this current point in the workforce.
Thank you, Lee. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at 7 hybrid leadership skills that are important for this new environment. We're going to talk about what it is, and we'll offer you a strategy or 2 for each one of them. So Lee, why don't we start with drive performance? Can you walk us through that, please?
Sure. I think what we would, just as kind of a caveat as we go through these, anybody looking at the slide, these might look like standard leadership strategies or what you learned for an on-site environment, what was discussed in remote. Just keep in mind that for a hybrid situation, there's a nuance to each of these. So, and each of these needs to be performed both slightly differently and a little bit more effectively. So it's going to call on some different parts of the skills. Driving performance and trust, you don't want to get into a situation where you're babysitting. If you have all of your team on site on a given day, that's the last day that you want to be babysitting. We don't want to go with management by walking around. You want to really engage and allow them the independence to meet, in dyads or meet just in small groups with you in the room, without you in the room. You're not going to drive performance by commanding everybody to be in every meeting together, nor will you drive it by stepping into what they're doing at all times. So on-site, allow some flex time for people to meet in small groups. In a remote sense, just don't get hung up in policing the dots, I call it, are they away from the desk? Are they there? Ultimately, you need to trust that your team is going to do what they need to do, and empower them with a little bit of that leeway, a little bit of autonomy to do so, and you'll be a lot more pleased with the results.
Perfect. Thank you, Lee. I'm going to talk about lead with empathy and compassion. And we look at this skill and we might think, this is not really a skill. And so, but empathy is an actual skill in itself. It's not just a quality we have. And it's not a matter whether you were born with it. It's something that we can develop. And empathy is actually a technical tool that you employ to impact a relationship. So let me give you a concrete example. People could be frustrated by having to come into the office. So we can say simply, I hear that you're feeling frustrated by having to come into the office. You don't have to fix this, but what you do need to do is to really make the person demonstrate that that person is heard and that person is listened to. Lee, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I just think that Claire, you're spot on in that, making sure that they feel heard, making sure that they do feel that someone has engaged with them enough to listen. Sometimes that alone makes a difference with an employee. It makes them feel seen.
Exactly. Now, we're going to move on to hybrid communication. And when we think about hybrid communication, we immediately go to technology. And we do have to be comfortable with technology, but it's beyond that. Lee, can you talk about using hybrid communication effectively and what that actually means and a strategy that you can use?
Sure. I think the clarity is going to be the biggest key. Concise, but not to the point that you lose the context for a direction. Just keep in mind that when you're working in a hybrid sense, you may have people who are receiving the information from you face to face, and others on your team might be getting the same information in a written form. So if I am receiving instruction or I'm learning about a challenge that we need to solve, and I'm hearing everything that's going into it, and I'm seeing all the body language, and I have a chance to kind of talk through and bounce ideas back and forth, that's very different than if I'm receiving information on a SharePoint assignment or a Teams chat, or even an email. So I think in cases like that, you want to really be sure that there's continuity in the communication so that every team member has the same depth of information as the others. Mm-hmm. Unless someone is specifically tasked with cascading that information to the other team members, that's your job. You, as a leader, you need to make sure everybody has the same message, the same mission, and the same purpose. Clarity, we're going to avoid vague language. This is easy to creep into. You also want to avoid things that sound apologetic. So we're not just going to ask you to do something. Could you please? I'd like you to, if you have a chance. Those are words that take up a lot of space. They add to noise, and they're not cushioning the blow like you think they are. So they, in a hybrid sense, I think you can, certainly in a remote sense, we've had a chance to kind of, I'd say carve those off of some of the instructions and some of the statements. Right. You're the leader. You need your team to do some things for you. You need to work together to accomplish things, or you need them to work with one of their colleagues to accomplish something. So use that language obviously in a very professional way. But the more clear that you can be, and the more you can name people who are responsible for things, who are accountable, the more clarity each of your team members has. And that is the one thing that people consistently say face-to-face or remote when they discuss a leader, any uncertainty in their purpose and in the outcome that's intended. It's that the leader is just not conveying prioritization, clarity, or consistent information. So cannot stress that enough. Since you're communicating in multiple environments, you have to kind of be on the ball in a few different settings right now.
And Lee, I want to add one thing to that. Make sure when you do have a communication that it goes to the remote folks and the face-to-face folks at the same time. So absolutely critical. Okay, we're going to move on to number 4, champion development. Lee, all yours.
Champion development is how you're going to find the, you can call them change leaders, you can call them difference makers. They're going to be your star players. If you follow the 80-20 rule, the Pareto principle, they're probably the 20% that are doing 80% of the work. The reality is we are all on teams, have been in teams like that. They are also the people, though, that are easy to miss, I'll say, because they're not causing any grief, they're not causing any aggravation, they're just getting their work done. They may also have great relationships with their coworkers, with their colleagues, especially over the last few years. If they've been able to foster that in a remote setting with all the stressors we have going on, those are people you really want to tap. They are your champions, and they are the ones that you should be developing. The leadership principle, develop your replacement. That really does go a long way, whether it's in mentoring or just identifying a change maker. They're going to be your advocate. They're going to be the go-to people that you can entrust with different projects or programs or work. It's going to get done. There's going to be a driver to it. You have that trust. Empower them with different projects, with different accountabilities. And you'll be really surprised, really impressed with how quickly people can step up to that because someone has expressed confidence in them. But that's a big part of champion development. And I'd say leadership development has been something that has really stumbled in organizations over the past few years with the changing work contexts.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move on to keep your fingers on the pulse of your team. But when we think about it, we're really talking about keeping your fingers on the emotional pulse of your team and also the task-related pulse of your team. And it's much harder in a hybrid environment because it's often out of sight, out of mind. So Lee, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, the fingers on the emotional pulse. I think one of the biggest things to look for, or a strategy, is you always want to watch for a continuous personality, I would say, from a team member. So there are some people that are more comfortable in person than they are in chat. There are some people who are very witty in chat, and then when you meet them in person, you're sometimes surprised it's the same person because they're just, it could be a shy person or an introverted person, and they're just very comfortable
Right.
speaking a certain way, or being engaging. And that's fine. We each have a comfort zone. What you want to watch for is when that person is acting differently in a given setting. If they were previously quiet, retiring, and now they're a bit over the top, they seem like they're trying to prove that they're happy or team players. Something has usually tripped that with that person, and that's something to just keep an eye out for. It's easy to find people who are grumpy or cranky or or obviously look stressed. But the people who are overtly masking it, sometimes we miss that. That's when, and that's going to be more visible on site. I think when you're working together face to face, hybrid or remote, when you start seeing passive aggression creeping in, and if you take a step back from some of the communications and just read them at face value for the way that they read, Teams keeps an archive. You can scroll back up in the thread. Slack does also. If you see a change in tone, not just brisk one day because everybody's in a hurry, but over time, that is an indication that there's a stressor going on. Something is causing that employee to push back in the only way that they feel that they can, consciously or unconsciously, the way they feel that they can. And that's where passive aggression trips in. And a task-based related pulse, that's where the pace of work, both the quality and the quantity, there's something odd about the throughput. You might not be able to put your finger exactly on it, but you're noticing it, and you're noticing that it's not just today. It's not just, yesterday or the day before. Something is going on that's causing a disconnect, bottlenecks that didn't exist previously. That can be a little trickier, like anything, managing in a hybrid environment, because you're in two separate places with alternating schedules, as are your teams. But you really have to watch the throughput levels, and you have to watch the quality of the work and the engagement with the work when people are home or in, on site and back in the office.
And if you're hearing something, you're hearing a different tone, or you're hearing silence, or you're hearing something that is not typical of somebody, go back to the empathy and compassion.
Exactly.
And reach out to them. Go to them and say, Lee, I heard something in your tone today. Is there something going on for you? Check in with them. Don't just leave it. And that leads into active listening. So Lee, do you want to talk about that?
Correct. Active listening, again, Claire, we joked around that there's a specific sequencing to these points, because you can't necessarily have effective active listening without empathy. Keeping your fingers on the pulse, active listening
Right.
is going to build on that. So active listening, instead of your radar going up every so often, or something trips your radar, this is more just being a part of the conversations in a way that's very mindful and very engaged. You are listening for the content as well as the packaging to an extent.
Right.
This is where you're going to hear people who are getting a little frustrated, people who feel misunderstood or feel like they're being cut off. Big signs for this, big strategies to employer. It's the continuity in communication that we talked about in point number 3 in a hybrid context. Claire, you touched on it. Make sure teams are getting instructions or information at the same time. With active listening, this gives you a chance to make sure your full team is understanding, is on board with what they're supposed to do. They understand what their specific role is, whether they are sitting next to you in a room, or whether you are each on your team's cameras, or we're on Zoom. There's continuity in the understanding. Active listening is going to look a little different virtually than it will in person. It's going to look a little differently in email than it may in chat. There's some subtleties, and it's going to take time. It's going to take a little bit of practice, but I would actually encourage you to, just as a practice step, go back to 2 different people on your team, say from last week, go back up to Monday. If it's, go Monday through Friday, and just read some of the dialogue and see, was it fairly standard throughout the week? Do that for another person. Those are great ways to see. You can almost actually at times play back in your mind what the prevailing mood was, but you'll see the indicators. You've got some of the information right there. You don't have to be psychic. We're not saying you need to be, but you do need to be attuned to nuances and things like that, particularly between team members and colleagues.
Perfect. Last one, and then we're going to delve into this. So Lee, can you talk about established team culture and norms?
Yeah, so one of the things that's happened with hybrid work contexts, for instance, is people tend to see it as you have on-site, you have remote, you have hybrid, as if it's this third solution, but it's as clear cut as the other two. And it's not. I would see it as a continuum of, we're on site, and then depending upon the structure for your agency or your organization, or even your team and their roles, you may have anywhere between on-site and remote. So first, give yourself that latitude to realize that what works for other teams in, your colleague's organization, or somebody that, you play pickleball with, for instance, what's working in their business is not necessarily going to work in your team, and vice versa. And that's okay, because you're building your team. You're not building their team. So you want to make sure that there's an established culture of norms, and Claire's going to go into something that a tool that we use that's very effective in driving the dialogue to drive the patterns of behavior in that culture. But culture reinforcement, culture shaping and culture reinforcement has been something leaders have talked about consistently during the pandemic, that it was very challenging. They blamed it on remote work. To me, that's a bit, of a short sell on how stressful a pandemic and then encroaching economic upheaval were. You have people who are just strained every facet of their lives. So maybe it wasn't just the remote. Maybe it was a little bit harder because of the remote. So I encourage you to not put up any barriers that this is only going to work on site or only going to work remote. The point is, you want to have operating norms. What's acceptable for people on your team when they're working with each other, when they're reporting to you, when you're reporting back to them? Claire, I know you want to delve into the team operating agreement. I think that's where this is going to take us.
It absolutely is. And some people call it a team charter. Some people call it a team operating agreement. Essentially, it's the same. So what is it? A team operating agreement gives your team a voice and it manages expectations. So it's not about the work we do, it's about how we work together as a team. So it defines a set of behavioral norms the team agrees to abide by. And that is the critical piece. It's created by the team, for the team, not by the leaders. And it sets the stage for how we're going to work together. And it results in team collaboration, productivity, connectedness, and really very, very clear expectations. And so let's take a look at a 7-step process. And I'm going to go through each of these steps. So brainstorm and list. The first part is you have to have each team member list what they would like to see become part of the team operating agreement. So let's look at a couple of them. Things like, how are we going to talk? How are we going to talk to each other? So it could be expected response times. What's been happening in remote teams when we were fully virtual is that, people would get emails after work hours. What's the expectation there? Is the expectation to respond? Or is it, I'm just sending you something, you don't have to respond till 9 a.m. in the morning. So what is the expected response time? Another is, how will we meet? Where will we meet? Are we going to be meeting in the office this time? Are we going to be meeting remotely? What's the scheduling? What's the frequency? And then, people are very concerned about the value of coming into the office. So it's when we come into the office, what activities will bring value to the team? What will we be doing? Another thing that we could create a team operating agreement for is providing feedback. And I'm taking this out of Lee's playbook. So Lee, you can certainly add anything here. It's about providing feedback. When do you provide feedback? Do you provide feedback at the time, even if the person is remote? Or do you wait until the person comes into the office to provide them feedback? And that sets up, I'm going to come into the office, and every time I'm going to come into the office, I'm going to be getting negative feedback. So you really want to give feedback at the time. And Lee, I'm going to let you talk about that in 1 second if you'd like to add something. I'm just going to finish this piece. And how do we share information? And I mentioned this before. It's so critical that the remote folks and the face-to-face folks get the information at the same time. Lee, do you want to add anything to this before I continue?
No, I just think that as you touched on the part about providing feedback, we tend to have this mentality that we'll wait till we're all together, or wait till we're in person and can talk to the person, in person, face to face, if there's something that's challenging to discuss. And you are doing a great job of conditioning your employees that every day that they go in the office is going to be like going to the principal's office, and nobody likes that feeling. So, if there's something challenging, we're all adults. Just discuss it with them. If they're remote that day, if you are, discuss it with them remotely, discuss it with them. Imperfect communication at the perfect time is always better than waiting and delaying and then you're a bit away from the moment.
I love the imperfect communication. That's a great analogy. So step 2 is you've got to make it smart. Now, we've all heard of specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. But the 2 key elements that I want to mention is it has to be attainable for your team. If it's not attainable, don't do it. If it's not relevant for your team, don't do it. The other piece that's very important here is you've got to make it so clear that there's no misunderstanding. And the example I like to use is we will respect ourselves. My view of respect is very different to somebody else's view. And this is a story I love telling. I was working with a team that was highly, highly, highly dysfunctional. And their team operating agreement is we will not swear to each other. We will not swear at each other. And that was their version of respect. Now, that's not going to be my version of respect or Lee's version of respect, or probably most of your versions of respect. So every team operating agreement is unique and every team is unique. And so it has to be very clear and it has to be very specific. It also has to be relevant for your team. So let's take a look at 2 team operating agreements that are smart. Now, if you notice, they're created in 1 paragraph. It's not bullet points, and it's also 1 topic. So the challenge is communication challenge, not having access to relevant information in a timely manner. So let's take a look at it. When post-meeting minutes need to be shared, the moderator, so who's going to be sending it, will post the information in their platform, whatever it is, within 2 hours of the meeting. So it's time-based, and send a link to the meeting invitees. The second one is cascading information. So when decisions are made in the program management team, the team members are responsible for immediate circulation, and we can define immediate circulation. It could be within 20 minutes of the meeting of the decision that impact their stakeholders. So your team operating agreement items need to be smart. Then prioritize. If you have a team of 18 people and every single person gives their idea of a team operating agreement, then you're going to have 18 items. That's way too many to start with. So we recommend begin with 4 to 6 team operating agreements. If you're using Zoom, if you're using Teams, you can have people check mark the top 3, 4, or 5 items that are most important for them. Then discuss. This is where it gets interesting, and this is where it takes a lot of time. So everybody has to agree to it. Now, what does that actually mean? It means that there's got to be buy-in. I've got to be able to live with it. If I can't live with it, then don't do it. That means it has to be modified or removed. So you discuss each item to ensure buy-in. If there's disagreement, then modify or remove it, or live with each statement. So 3 very important tips for creating a team operating agreement. Accountability is number 1. The leader is not accountable for this. The team is. So anybody can say, we had decided that we're going to have agendas during the meeting, or we're not going to multitask during the meetings. And guys, I'm seeing it happening. I'm seeing it happen. Can we go back to our team operating agreement? The second item is consensus. We want to make sure that people can live with it. If people don't live with it, then there's not going to be any buy-in. And the third is, why is a team operating agreement? Why bother? It's if you don't have a system worked out in advance to manage expectations, it becomes a constant negotiation, and you're wasting time and you're wasting energy. We're all moving into a new environment, and it's so important right now to create these norms of behavior, to create these charters. Lee, any comments about what I've said so far? Anything you'd like to add?
No, I think the point, yeah, if I were to zone in on anything or hone in on anything, I would say the accountability. Who's responsible for enforcing? It's such a key point that this is not just you're creating a set of rules and your team is going to follow them. It's not your team is creating a set of rules and you're going to be the, you know, the marshal that's going to be handling these things, or the sergeant at arms instead of the leader. There's a culture will help support them. A culture will help manage and monitor them. So that's your job as the leader, is to foster the culture that makes these things the behavioral norm.
Right. I was coaching a client a number of years ago, and we were talking about a team operating agreement. And we talked about it. I took her through the process. She went back, she created the team operating agreement. The next session, I said, so how did it go? She said, it didn't work. It didn't work. And I said, well, why? Who created it? And she said, well, I did. I created our norms of behavior. I handed it over to the team, and there was absolutely no buy-in. And I told her, go back, get them involved. And they created it, and they're still using it to this day. So I want to thank you very much for listening and joining us today. To learn more, don't hesitate to reach out. You can contact myself or Lee at 416-398-5160. And it's info@virtualteambuilders.com. Any last comments, Lee?
No, I think that we've touched on enough, Claire, and I just am looking forward to meeting some of the listeners and to working with them as they build their operating agreements.
Thank you, Lee, and thank you everybody again for listening.
Thank you.